In the remote hills of Montana, just beyond the reach of civilization, lives a rancher by the name of Sam Calder. To the world, he's nothing more than a quiet, solitary man who tends to his cattle and works the land. But beneath the surface lies a man with a past. A man whose deadly accuracy with a revolver once made him the most feared gunslinger in the West. When a group of ruthless outlaws set their sights on his land, they mistake his silence for weakness. But they'll soon learn that underestimating Sam Calder is the last mistake they'll ever make. What happens next will shatter the outlaw gang and bring their empire to its knees. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the flat plains of Montana. The wind blew through the tall grasses, sending ripples across the land that stretched for miles in every direction. The world was vast here, wide open and unforgiving. It was a place where men could disappear and never be found. A place where the land could either break you or make you stronger. Sam Calder had chosen this land years ago. He had come to Montana looking for something he couldn't name. A place to forget, a place to start fresh. He had built his ranch from the ground up, working the land with a quiet determination that spoke volumes without ever saying a word. Sam wasn't much for talking. He wasn't a man who sought company or conversation. His past had been filled with too much noise, too many words. Out here, it was just him, the land, and the cattle he cared for. The ranch was small but functional, nestled at the foot of a range of jagged hills that were as hard and unforgiving as the man who lived beneath them. There was a small, one-room cabin with a wood stove for warmth, a corral for the horses, and a barn that Sam had built himself. He had a few tools, a rifle, and his old revolver. His most prized possession, hidden under his bed where it had always been. He was a man of few needs, but one thing he never went without was his gun. Sam's reputation was known to some, though few knew the full extent of it. He had once been a gunslinger, a man who had earned his name in towns across the West, feared by those who had crossed him and respected by those who knew his skill with a revolver. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, Sam Calder was just a rancher, quiet, solitary, content, or so it seemed. Today, the ranch was quiet, as it always was in the early evening. Sam sat outside his cabin, a weathered hat pulled low over his brow, watching the horizon as the wind rustled through the grass. He was used to the silence. It was comfortable to him, but the peace of the evening was about to be shattered. A distant rumble broke the stillness, the sound of horses' hooves growing louder as riders approached. Sam didn't move. He could hear the steady thud of the hooves, the sound of men who weren't in any hurry. They weren't trying to make their presence known quickly. This wasn't a group passing through. It was a group that had come with a purpose. He stood slowly, his hand brushing the handle of his revolver as he made his way toward the front of the cabin. He didn't need to see the riders to know what was coming. The way they rode, the slow, deliberate pace, told him everything he needed to know. These weren't lawmen or travelers. These were men looking for trouble. He could see them now, their figures emerging from the dust and haze of the setting sun. For riders, their faces were hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, but Sam could see the glint of their guns, their hands resting near their holsters. They weren't just looking for shelter or supplies. They had come here for something else, something they thought they could take. One of the riders, the leader by the look of it, dismounted first, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The others followed suit, but none of them made a move to draw their guns. They didn't need to. They had come here for a reason, and Sam Calder, in their minds, was just another rancher. A quiet, unassuming man who wouldn't put up much of a fight. "You Sam Calder?" the leader asked, his voice carrying over the wind. Sam didn't answer immediately. He studied the group in front of him, his gaze sweeping over each of the men with the calm of someone who had seen it all. His face remained stoic, unreadable. "You don't talk much, do you?" the leader continued, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's fine by me. We ain't here to chat. We're here to make you an offer." Sam's hand never left the handle of his revolver. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to explain himself. His reputation had already spoken for him, but these men had come to challenge him. They thought he was just a quiet rancher. They had no idea what they were about to face. "We've been watching this land of yours," the leader went on, his voice growing more confident as he sized Sam up. "And it seems to me like you could use some help. See, we've got an arrangement with the landowners around here, and we thought you might want to join us." Sam didn't flinch. He wasn't interested in their deals or their threats. He had built this place with his own hands, and he wasn't about to give it up to anyone. "We're talking what we need, one way or another," the leader said, a cruel edge to his voice. "Either you give it to us, or we take it. Your call." Sam took a slow step forward, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. His eyes locked with the leader's, his gaze as cold as the land he had claimed for himself. "You've made a mistake," Sam said quietly, his voice low and steady. "This land's not yours to take." The leader laughed, the sound harsh and full of derision. "We'll see about that, old man. You think you can stop us?" Sam didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already moving. The leader of the outlaws took a step forward, his smirk widening as he reached for the gun at his hip. The other 3 men followed suit, each of them adjusting their stance, ready to draw their pistols. They clearly believed they had Sam Calder figured out. He was just a quiet rancher, after all. They thought that he'd cower, that he'd beg for his life. They were wrong. Sam's hand remained steady on the grip of his revolver, though his movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't draw the gun just yet. There was no need for haste. The outlaws thought they controlled the situation, but Sam knew that was the mistake they'd make. "I don't want no trouble," the leader called, his hand inching closer to his weapon. "Just cooperate, and this will all go smoothly. You're a smart man, Sam. I can see that. No need for bloodshed." The rancher said nothing, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in. He had faced down men like these before, arrogant, thinking they could push people around. But Sam Calder was a man who didn't bow to anyone. He wasn't going to let these men dictate the terms. The leader's hand hovered just over his pistol now, and Sam could sense the tension in the air. His eyes flicked to the other riders, noting the way they all mirrored the leader's every move. They were waiting for a signal, for their leader to make the first move. It was a mistake. Sam had already decided what his move would be. The leader's finger twitched, and in that instant, Sam's reflexes took over. His revolver was out of the holster and aimed at the leader's chest before the man had even managed to draw his gun. The shot rang out with a deafening crack, the force of it shattering the silence of the ranch like a thunderclap. The leader's body jerked backward, a look of disbelief in his eyes as he crumpled to the ground in a heap. The other 3 riders froze, their hands halfway to their pistols, their faces pale with shock. Sam didn't wait for them to react. His revolver was already swinging in a smooth arc, his body shifting into position with the precision of a man who had lived through more gunfights than he cared to count. The second shot came before the men even had time to draw. The outlaw on the right collapsed, his body falling limp from the saddle, his gun still holstered at his side. The remaining 2 riders stumbled backward, their hands shooting up in surrender, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. They had expected resistance, but not this. They had expected a rancher to cower in fear. They hadn't counted on a gunslinger. One of the men, a young rider with a scar across his cheek, drew his revolver in desperation. His hand shook as he aimed it at Sam, but before he could fire, the rancher's revolver was already raised, the third shot piercing the air with an unmistakable crack. The rider's gun flew from his hand. His body jerked backward in the saddle, and he fell, lifeless, to the dirt. The last rider, the eldest of the group, stood frozen, his hands trembling as he stared at Sam with wide, horrified eyes. He hadn't even drawn his weapon. The sheer speed and accuracy of Sam's shots had left him paralyzed. Sam's revolver remained steady in his hand, the barrel still smoking from the recent shots. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence of the moment was enough. The leader and his gang had come for his land, but now they lay scattered in the dirt, their ambition and arrogance silenced in an instant. The last outlaw dropped his gun, the fear evident in his eyes. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaky. "I didn't know you were." You didn't know a lot of things, Sam said calmly, his voice low but filled with quiet power. He didn't have to explain. The man would learn, just as the others had. This ranch isn't for the taking, and neither am I. The outlaw stumbled back, his legs giving out beneath him as he fell to his knees. Please, please don't kill me, he begged, his face drenched in sweat. Sam didn't move, his gaze fixed on the trembling man before him. He had seen fear in many faces in his time, but there was something about this one that felt different, raw, desperate. The man had underestimated Sam, and now he was realizing the cost of that mistake. You can leave, Sam said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much bloodshed in his life to feel sympathy. But if I ever see you on my land again, I won't hesitate. The outlaw didn't waste another second. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror, and he ran, disappearing into the dust, his footsteps fading into the distance. Sam stood still, his hands still resting on the grip of his revolver. The air was thick with the aftermath of the gunfight, but the silence that followed felt oddly peaceful. He knew this wasn't the end. The outlaws were only the first of many who would come, drawn to the legend of the silent rancher and the man who could take down an entire gang without breaking a sweat. Sam didn't care. This land was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. The sun was sinking lower on the horizon, casting long shadows over the bodies of the outlaws and the land that Sam had claimed as his own. The fight was over, for now, but Sam Calder knew that the West was a place where the battles never truly ended. And the next fight, whenever it came, would be waiting. As the dust settled and the last of the outlaws' footsteps faded into the horizon, Sam Calder stood alone in the evening light, the weight of the revolver still resting in his hand. He let out a slow breath, the kind of breath that comes after a storm passes, when the adrenaline fades and the truth settles in. His gaze shifted over the fallen bodies of the outlaws, the men who had come to take from him, and he didn't feel any satisfaction or joy from the outcome. There was no celebration in the aftermath. There never was. The land, as always, was silent. The wide Montana plains stretched out before him, the sky overhead painted in the deep hues of dusk. But there was something about the silence after the gunfight that felt wrong. The wind had stopped, leaving only the occasional creak of the barn and the distant sound of the river winding through the land. It felt as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something more to come. Sam holstered his revolver and moved toward the fallen men, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. He didn't bother looking at the gang leader, who lay sprawled in a pool of blood, his fate sealed by a single shot. Instead, he knelt down next to the young outlaw with the scar on his cheek, the one who had fallen from his horse. Sam didn't care about the man's life or the reasons behind his actions, but there was one thing Sam couldn't abide: unnecessary cruelty. He checked the rider's pulse. The man was still breathing, but barely. Sam wasn't a doctor, but it was clear he wouldn't last long without help. His gaze shifted to the other two riders, their bodies already cold in the dust. It was over for them. The rancher didn't waste time. He left the wounded outlaw where he lay, moving to the barn to retrieve the cart. He wasn't sure why he bothered. In the past, men like this wouldn't have gotten a second chance. But there was something different about tonight, something that nagged at him. Maybe it was the fact that these men weren't the first to try to take his land, but they were the first to get this close. Maybe it was the fact that Sam had once been like them, young, arrogant, and reckless, but he had left that life behind long ago. No, he wasn't doing this for the outlaw. He was doing it for the piece of himself that he had locked away. Sam loaded the rider into the cart, securing him with a rope before pushing it toward the cabin. His mind wandered as he worked, thinking about the way these men had approached him, the way they had underestimated him. It was the same with everyone who had ever crossed him. They thought the quiet was a sign of weakness. They thought silence meant nothing. But they were wrong. When he reached the cabin, he unloaded the man, bringing him inside where the warmth of the fire still lingered in the air. Sam didn't speak. He didn't need to. The cowboy had barely stirred during the short ride, but now that he was on the ground, he groaned, his face contorted in pain. Where am I?" the outlaw mumbled, his voice hoarse. His eyes fluttered open, and he tried to sit up, but Sam held him down gently with one hand. "You're in my cabin. You've been shot," Sam replied quietly, his voice steady, calm, almost detached. The outlaw's eyes flicked toward him, searching his face for answers. Who are you?" Sam's gaze never wavered. "Someone who doesn't take kindly to men who come to rob his land." The outlaw's face twisted into something like fear, and Sam could see the panic starting to rise in the young man's eyes. His breathing grew shallow, and he looked around the cabin like he was trying to find some escape. "Please, I didn't mean no harm," he gasped, his hand reaching weakly toward Sam's. I got family back home. Sam didn't let him finish. He didn't care about the man's sob story, about his so-called family. It wasn't Sam's job to carry the burden of their choices. He wasn't here to save this man. He was here to make sure that the land remained his. It always had been, and it always would be. "You should have thought about that before you tried to steal from me," Sam said flatly. The outlaw's face paled, his breath ragged. "I was just following orders. We were hired to do it. The gang, we needed money bad. I swear, I didn't." Sam cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Doesn't matter. You're here now, and I've decided what I'm going to do about it." The outlaw's eyes grew wide. He began to shift, trying to push himself away from Sam, but his wounds made it impossible. Please don't. "I'm not gonna kill you," Sam said simply. He stood and walked toward the door, leaving the man alone in the cabin. The silence returned, but it felt heavier now. Sam didn't know why he'd spared the outlaw. Maybe it was the way he had begged. Maybe it was the way his own past had come creeping back, a reminder of the things he'd done when he was just another gunman with nothing to lose. But Sam had done enough in his life. He wasn't looking to add more blood to his hands. He stepped outside again, feeling the cool evening air wash over him. The sky was growing darker, but the storm that had threatened earlier had passed. It was quiet now, too quiet. Sam looked out over the land that had been his for so long, the open plains stretching into the horizon. The outlaws had come looking to take what was his, but they hadn't counted on Sam Calder being who he was, the most feared gunslinger in the West. And now, they would learn that the price of underestimating him was far higher than they could have imagined. Sam Calder stood at the edge of his ranch, the sky above him a deep, bruised purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The day was done, but the weight of the confrontation still hung in the air, lingering like smoke after a fire. He had killed 3 men and spared one, a decision that still gnawed at him. Part of him had always known that this life, the life of a gunslinger, a man who carried death in his holster, wasn't one you could easily leave behind. He had made a promise to himself to leave that life behind and seek solitude, peace, a place to heal the wounds that time had carved into him. But peace was a fleeting thing in the West, a land that didn't know how to forgive. The fire in the cabin crackled softly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the ranch. Inside, the young outlaw still lay unconscious, his breath slow but steady. Sam had done what he could to stop the bleeding, but there was nothing more he could do. If the man was going to survive, it wasn't because of anything Sam had done. It was up to him now, the outlaw, to decide if he was going to live or die. Sam took a long, slow breath, his mind wandering. The old memories began to surface, memories of the men he had once called comrades, of the battles he had fought and the lives he had taken. He had been a gunslinger long before he had ever come to Montana, a man who had built his reputation with speed, precision, and an uncanny ability to kill without hesitation. He had been feared across the frontier, but that life was over. At least, it had been. Sam glanced back at the cabin, his eyes scanning the door that he had closed behind him moments ago. The silence inside was unsettling. He wasn't sure if the outlaw would live through the night, but it didn't matter. He had done what he could, and that was enough. He stood up and walked back toward the barn, his boots crunching softly in the gravel. The ranch had always been his refuge, his place of solitude. He had built it with his own hands, brick by brick, piece by piece. But lately, it felt more like a prison. The peace he had longed for always seemed to slip just out of his reach. As he approached the barn, a sound broke the stillness of the night. It was faint at first, just the slightest sound of hooves in the distance. Sam stopped and listened, his senses sharpening. His hand instinctively moved toward his holstered revolver, the old, familiar weight reassuring. The sound of hooves grew louder, and soon, Sam could make out the silhouette of a rider approaching on horseback. The wind kicked up, and the rider came into view. A single man, moving at a steady pace, his horse cutting through the dust and the dimming light. Sam's hand remained on the grip of his revolver, his body tense, waiting. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, pulling his horse to a halt a few yards away. Sam's eyes flicked over him, taking in every detail. The man was tall, with dark, weathered clothes, a wide-brimmed hat hiding most of his face. But it wasn't the man's appearance that made Sam's pulse quicken. It was the way he held himself, relaxed but alert, a man who knew how to handle himself in the wild. The rider dismounted and took a few slow steps towards Sam, his movements deliberate. He didn't look like a lawman, nor did he look like an outlaw. He was just a man, but there was something about him that made Sam pause. This wasn't someone who had come for a friendly visit. "You Sam Calder?" the rider asked, his voice rough and low. Sam didn't answer right away. He studied the man for a moment, sizing him up. The outlaw had seen Sam's name on wanted posters, no doubt. They always did. But Sam didn't speak unless he had to. It wasn't in him to waste words. "I'm Sam Calder," he finally said, his voice calm, steady. The rider looked him over carefully, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out what kind of man Sam was. "You've got quite a reputation, Calder," the rider said, a half-smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "They say you're the fastest gun in the West." Sam didn't flinch. He had heard that too many times before. It wasn't a reputation he had earned for the sake of recognition. It had just come with the job. "I don't make a habit of living up to my reputation," Sam replied flatly. The rider chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. It was a laugh tinged with something darker, more calculating. "You've already made your name known," he said, "and that's exactly why I'm here. I've been sent to make sure you don't cause any more problems in this part of Montana." Sam's eyes narrowed. The rider wasn't alone. Sam could feel it now, the presence of others closing in on the land, hidden somewhere in the dark. The outlaw gang, the ones who had sent the men before, must have decided to pay him a visit, to tie up loose ends. The rider's hand rested on the hilt of his gun, a clear sign that the situation could turn dangerous at any moment. Sam's own hand hovered over his revolver, his fingers itching to draw, but he knew better than to rush. He had fought too many battles to make mistakes now. "You've come a long way to try to scare me," Sam said evenly, his eyes locking onto the rider's. "But I don't scare easy." The rider's smirk grew wider, and for a moment, Sam saw something else in the man's eyes. It wasn't fear, no. It was something colder. It was the look of a man who had come to finish what had been started. "You don't have a choice," the rider replied, his tone turning cold. "Either you leave this land, or I make sure you don't get a chance to do anything else." Sam's gaze hardened. The last time someone had made that kind of threat, they had learned the hard way not to underestimate him. "I'll leave when I'm good and ready," Sam said, his voice low and controlled. "But not before I've made sure that no one else comes onto my land to take what's mine." The rider's hand twitched, and in that instant, Sam knew it was going to happen. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The outlaw was ready to draw, but Sam Calder was faster. The air between Sam and the outlaw was thick with tension. The rider's fingers twitched near the grip of his gun. His eyes locked on Sam's every movement, waiting for the slightest indication that he should draw. Sam stood still, his hand never leaving the grip of his revolver, his mind sharp, his body poised like a coiled spring. He had been in countless standoffs before, and the rules were always the same. Fast hands, calm nerves. In the blink of an eye, the outlaw's hand shot for his pistol, the movement fast, smooth, practiced. But Sam was faster. His revolver was already in his hand, already raised, before the outlaw's hand had even cleared his holster. A single shot rang out, sharp and clear in the stillness of the evening. The sound echoed across the land, breaking the silence like a gunshot in a graveyard. The outlaw's body jerked as the bullet slammed into his chest, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He hadn't even had a chance to fully raise his gun before Sam had ended it. The man stumbled back, his knees buckling, and then crumpled to the ground in a heap, his hand still clutching the hilt of his revolver. Sam didn't look down at the fallen rider. He didn't need to. The man had made his move, and Sam had ended it in the same breath. There was no room for hesitation in the West. No room for second chances. The sound of hooves in the distance reminded him that this wasn't over. The other outlaws were still out there, and they would be coming for him, just as surely as the sun would rise tomorrow. Sam holstered his revolver and stood still for a moment, listening to the wind, the distant echoes of hooves, the rustle of the tall grasses swaying with the breeze. His pulse had steadied, but his mind was already in motion. The game was on, and the rest of the gang would be here soon. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow crossing the distance, 2 more riders galloping in from the north, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. They had seen what happened to their comrade, but they were determined to finish what they had started. Sam turned toward the barn, his hand reaching for the rifle he had propped against the wall. He moved quickly, efficiently, knowing the fight was far from over. He wasn't about to be caught off guard again. The first rider had underestimated him, and now these two would too. It was a mistake everyone made when they crossed Sam Calder. He had lived in this land long enough to know every rock, every tree, every rise in the terrain. He knew the way the wind shifted and how the sun cast shadows. There was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run, but there were places to stand and fight. The riders were getting closer now, their horses thundering over the open ground, their faces shadowed beneath the brim of their hats. The outlaw gang had learned, too late, that they had picked the wrong target. Sam raised his rifle, taking aim at the first rider, his breath steady. He had all the time in the world now, time to take a clean shot. The crosshairs were lined up perfectly, and with a steady squeeze of the trigger, the first rider's head snapped back as the bullet hit its mark. The second rider reacted quickly, pulling his reins hard, trying to pull his horse around. But Sam was already moving, already adjusting his aim. The second shot rang out, and the rider's horse let out a startled whinny as it buckled beneath him. The man went down, rolling in the dirt, his gun falling uselessly from his hand. The second rider didn't make a sound. The storm of gunfire had stopped as quickly as it had begun, and the only sound now was the wind rustling through the grass, the hooves of the fallen horses as they twitched in the dirt. Sam didn't waste a second. He moved quickly, stepping over the bodies of the outlaws as he made his way toward the road. His mind was already racing, calculating the movements of the remaining gang members. They wouldn't be far behind. He had killed 4 men now, but there was still the rest of the gang to contend with. The world had become quiet again, as if everything were holding its breath. But Sam knew better than to let his guard down. He had been in enough fights to know that the real danger often came after the first wave of gunfire. He was almost to the barn when he heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching again. This time, however, it wasn't just 2 riders. It was a group, a full band of them, moving fast, coming from all directions. Sam didn't hesitate. He knew the terrain well enough to know they'd try to surround him. He was outnumbered, but he had one advantage they didn't have, the knowledge of the land. He turned quickly and headed for the hill behind the barn, taking cover behind the large outcrop of rocks that jutted out from the ground. The outlaws were closing in, their horses' hooves beating against the earth like the ticking of a clock. Sam's heart rate remained steady, his mind clear. He took a moment to reload his rifle, his movements precise, practiced. From his vantage point, he could see the riders moving toward the barn, fanning out in search of him. They were good. He had to give them that. They had spread out, trying to catch him in a pincer movement. But they had made one mistake. They didn't know Sam Calder. As the first rider moved closer, Sam raised his rifle again, aimed, and fired. The shot hit its mark, the rider falling without a sound. The second rider turned in surprise, but it was too late. Sam was already on him, his revolver drawn and fired before the man could even react. Sam Calder didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The outlaws were learning the hard way that when you challenge the silent rancher, you face a man who had long ago earned his place among the deadliest gunslingers in the West. And they weren't going to make it out alive. The silence of the open plains settled over Sam Calder once more as he stood behind the rocks, his rifle still aimed at the approaching riders. His body moved with the efficiency of years spent in solitude and violence, his every motion deliberate, his heart steady. There were no more words left to be spoken. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. The dead outlaws scattered across his land spoke for him. The remaining gang members had clearly realized their mistake. The remaining riders, now only a handful, were spread out wide, their horses kicking up the dust in their effort to outmaneuver Sam. He had killed 6 men now, and the rest had learned that Sam wasn't just a rancher. He was the last man you wanted to cross. As the second wave of riders drew near, Sam shifted his weight, crouching lower behind the rocks. He adjusted his grip on the rifle. The cold steel of it felt right in his hands, a tool that had become as natural to him as breathing. The gang was disorganized now, their confidence shattered. Sam's shots had scattered them, but Sam wasn't fool enough to believe they had given up. Outlaws like these didn't retreat, not without a fight. And Sam Calder knew the nature of men who had nothing left to lose. They would come, whether it was for gold or vengeance or pride. He just had to be ready. He heard them before he saw them. The sound of hooves pounding the earth, the riders pushing hard, moving fast, trying to cut him off. But they weren't as close as they thought. Sam could hear them coming from the north side, where the trail dipped slightly into a small ravine. The terrain there was perfect for an ambush, but Sam wasn't caught by surprise. He had spent enough time in this land to know its secrets. The first rider appeared at the edge of the ravine, his silhouette outlined against the sky. He was riding low, his body hunched over his saddle as he scanned the terrain. Sam waited, breath held, eyes locked on the rider. He had one shot, one chance to make it count. The outlaw rode closer, his eyes sweeping over the land. Sam raised his rifle, taking careful aim. The wind shifted slightly, and he exhaled slowly, calming his mind. The shot rang out, and the rider's body jerked back as the bullet struck him square in the chest. His horse reared in panic, throwing him to the ground with a sickening thud. The remaining riders cursed and scattered. They had seen what happened to their comrade, and now they were in full retreat, trying to regroup. But Sam knew better than to let them recover. They would be back, and this time, they'd be even more determined. He didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly from behind the rocks, making his way down the slight incline that led to the barn. He could feel the weight of the land beneath him, each step purposeful, calculated. The gang was no longer an organized group. They were a disjointed mess of men scrambling to recover their composure. Sam moved quickly, positioning himself behind a large hay bale near the barn door. His revolver was at the ready now, each chamber loaded, his breath steady. There were 3 riders left. He could hear them closing in, their hooves shaking the ground beneath him, but he wasn't worried. He knew he had the advantage. The first rider burst into view, his horse charging toward the barn door. Sam was already in motion. The revolver came up in one fluid motion, and with a quick, practiced squeeze of the trigger, the rider fell. His body jerked, the horse continuing without its rider. The next 2 men appeared moments later, moving in from either side, their pistols drawn. Sam didn't have much time, but he knew he didn't need it. They thought they had the advantage, but in reality, they were too close, too predictable. They were making a fatal mistake. Sam ducked low, rolling behind a stack of barrels as the 2 outlaws fired. The bullets missed, their shots wild. They hadn't even seen him move. With his revolver still raised, Sam fired once, twice. Both riders fell, their bodies hitting the dirt in quick succession. No screams, no cries of pain, just the sharp crack of gunfire. The barn was still now, save for the sound of the wind and the faint rustling of the grass in the distance. The riders were dead, their bodies scattered across the ground. And Sam Calder, the silent rancher, stood victorious. But there was no sense of triumph in the air, no satisfaction, only the weight of a life he'd chosen long ago. The life of a man who had made peace with his past, only to have it come rushing back with the first sign of trouble. Sam holstered his revolver, the weight of it familiar, but heavier now. His hand brushed against the worn leather of his coat, and he paused for a moment. The land around him was his. It always had been. But the momentary peace he had worked so hard to build was fleeting. This was the West, where men like him were always hunted, always watched. The wind picked up again, the dust swirling around him, and Sam Calder didn't turn to look at the bodies of the outlaws. He didn't need to. They would be forgotten soon enough. But the ranch? That was his to protect. That was where he would stand his ground. There was still work to be done. The sun was setting, but the day's battles were far from over. Sam didn't know what the next day would bring, but he was ready. He always had been. The evening air was growing colder, the last rays of the sun slipping behind the distant hills, leaving the land bathed in twilight. The fire inside Sam Calder's cabin crackled softly, casting long shadows against the walls. The bodies of the outlaws still lay scattered outside, their horses left to wander aimlessly in the wind, their lifeless forms a grim testament to the violence that had just unfolded on his land. Sam Calder stood outside, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he wiped the sweat from his brow, the weight of his revolver still hanging heavy at his side. He had learned long ago that in the West, peace never lasted. It was always a matter of when, not if, the next storm would arrive. He turned slowly, the wind biting at his face, and entered the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed him, but Sam didn't feel comforted. He hadn't felt comforted in years. The fire, the land, the solitude. It was all a way to keep the ghosts at bay, to escape the past he had tried so desperately to outrun. But the past never stayed gone for long. The outlaw he had spared lay unconscious on the floor near the hearth, his shallow breathing the only indication that he was still alive. Sam had dragged him in from the cold after the fight, though he wasn't sure why. There was no reason to waste energy on someone who had come to kill him, but something about the boy's desperation had stopped him. Maybe it was the pleading in his eyes. Maybe it was the look of a man who hadn't yet realized what kind of life he had chosen. Sam's hand brushed against the revolver at his side, his fingers lingering for a moment on the cold steel. He'd been a gunslinger once. Long before he ever came to Montana, he had built a reputation that had spread across the West like wildfire. He had killed men who had come for him, men who had made the mistake of underestimating him. And now, as a rancher, that same reputation followed him wherever he went. Men like these outlaws came because of that reputation. They thought they could take what they wanted from a quiet man, but Sam had learned long ago that silence didn't mean weakness. His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet rustle of movement from across the room. The outlaw was waking up. His eyes fluttered open, groggy and disoriented, and Sam watched as he slowly pushed himself up, wincing at the pain in his chest where Sam's bullet had found its mark. "You're alive," Sam said quietly, his voice steady but distant. The outlaw's eyes darted around the cabin, panic rising in his gaze as he realized where he was. Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. "You're in my cabin," Sam replied, crossing his arms over his chest as he leaned against the wall. "And unless you want to end up like the rest of your gang, I suggest you stay put." The outlaw, his chest still heaving with shallow breaths, glanced at the door and then at Sam, as if weighing his options. There was fear in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that Sam had seen countless times before. He had been that man, once. Young, full of reckless ambition, too eager to prove himself. But that kind of life had a way of catching up with a man. The outlaw opened his mouth to speak, but Sam held up a hand, cutting him off. "I don't care what your name is. I don't care about your past or what you're running from. You try to rob me, and you'll pay for it. But I'll give you a choice. You can leave and never come back, or I can finish what I started." The outlaw's eyes widened, his lips trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just following orders. Please, you gotta understand." Sam's eyes hardened. "No, I don't have to understand. You came here looking to steal from me, looking to take what I've built. I don't care if you were following orders. The moment you pointed a gun at me, you made your choice." The outlaw looked like he was about to say something else, but Sam's cold gaze silenced him. Sam had no sympathy for men like him. He had been that man once, but he was no longer a fool. He had learned that weakness wasn't a luxury in the West, and neither was sentiment. "You're lucky I spared you," Sam added, his voice low but unmistakably dangerous. "But don't make me regret it." The outlaw swallowed hard, the fear in his eyes deepening. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. Sam could see the fear taking root in him, the realization that he was no longer in control of his fate. He was at the mercy of the man he had tried to rob, the man who had once been a feared gunslinger. "You're a damn fool," Sam said, turning away from the outlaw and heading for the door. He glanced over his shoulder before stepping outside. "But I'm giving you a chance to walk away." The night air was cold, the wind howling across the plains. Sam took a deep breath, his mind still sharp, his body still tense from the fight. The outlaws were gone, but they wouldn't be the last. There would always be more, always men like them who would come to take what they thought they could claim. But Sam Calder wasn't afraid of them. He had made his stand, and he would continue to make it, no matter who came. The faintest sound reached his ears, a rustling in the distance. Another rider, maybe another fool who thought he could take Sam's land. But Sam Calder had seen enough to know that the storm was far from over. The quiet was just an illusion, and when the next wave came, he would be ready. Sam Calder stood outside his cabin, the cold Montana wind whipping around him as he surveyed the darkening horizon. The last of the outlaws was still inside, nursing his wounds, and Sam wasn't sure how he felt about leaving him alive. It wasn't that he had a soft heart. No, Sam had left that part of himself behind long ago. But there was something different about this one, something in his eyes that made Sam pause. He had seen the fear before, but this man was different. Maybe it was because he had been willing to beg, or perhaps it was because Sam had once been that young man, desperate for something better, too proud to admit when he was out of his depth. Sam took a deep breath, the icy air burning his lungs. The world around him was still, the wind picking up again as if to remind him that the fight wasn't over. He could feel it deep in his bones, the knowledge that there was more to come. The outlaws he had just killed might have been the first wave, but they wouldn't be the last. He had to stay alert. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The cabin door creaked open behind him, and he turned to see the outlaw emerging, his movements slow and pained, but still defiant. The man was younger than Sam had initially thought, maybe in his early 20s, with dark hair that hung messily over his forehead and a scar along his cheek that looked fresh. His clothes were weathered, and his boots were caked with mud from the ride. "I'm leaving," the outlaw said, his voice rough but steady. "I'll keep my word. I won't come back." Sam studied him for a moment, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question hanging between them. Would the outlaw stay true to his word? Or would he find a way to return and finish what he had started? "You'd better," Sam replied, his voice low, measured. "If you're lying, I'll find you. And when I do, it won't be a second chance." The outlaw nodded, his face pale from blood loss, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. He wasn't built for this kind of life. Sam could see it in the way he moved, in the hesitation in his eyes. This wasn't the world the outlaw had been prepared for. It wasn't a place for men who couldn't stomach what needed to be done. "I won't come back," the outlaw repeated, more to himself than to Sam. He took a step back, his hand resting on the doorframe as if preparing to leave, but something seemed to stop him. "I didn't know you were," he hesitated, his voice faltering. "You were the one they call the Ghost." Sam raised an eyebrow. The Ghost was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that had been whispered in saloons and on dusty trails. It was a name that was feared in every corner of the frontier. The name had belonged to a man who had disappeared, who had left the world of gunslinging behind for a quieter life. But the past had a way of finding those who tried to leave it. "Doesn't matter what they call me," Sam said, his tone flat. "Doesn't matter what anyone calls me. I'm just a man who knows how to protect what's mine." The outlaw swallowed hard, clearly intimidated by the implication of the name. "I didn't know," he muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "I thought you were just a rancher. That's why he trailed off, not finishing the sentence. His eyes flickered back to Sam, a flicker of realization dawning on him. Sam let the silence hang for a moment, watching the young man carefully. He had spared his life, but he could see the unease in his eyes. The outlaw wasn't sure whether he had made the right choice. In that moment, Sam saw the youth's fear. But he also saw something else, a kind of recognition. The realization that he had made a terrible mistake. "Get on your horse and get out of here," Sam said, his voice hard but steady. "And don't come back. If you do, I'll end it the way I should have from the start. Do I make myself clear?" The outlaw nodded quickly, his face pale. Without another word, he turned and hurried out the door, disappearing into the cold night. Sam stood still for a long moment, listening to the sound of the man's footsteps fading into the distance. The wind was picking up again, the cold biting into his skin as the last of the outlaws left his ranch. Sam didn't move, didn't speak. He wasn't sure if the outlaw would keep his word. He wasn't sure of anything, not anymore. This was the West, where nothing was certain and everyone was just a moment away from becoming another casualty. The silence returned to the ranch, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a man who had survived, yes, but who knew that survival often came at a cost. The price of protecting his land, of keeping his past at bay, had never been higher. Sam turned back to the cabin, his eyes still sharp, his mind alert. The evening was growing colder, and the stars were just beginning to flicker in the sky above. He didn't know if the outlaw would return, but he was ready. He had to be. There was always more danger on the horizon. And Sam Calder was not the kind of man who ever took a fight lying down. The ranch was his, and it would stay that way. The night had settled in around Sam Calder's ranch, the wind howling through the sparse trees, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. The starlit sky above, though beautiful, seemed to only magnify the emptiness of the land. A bitter silence enveloped the ranch, broken only by the occasional creak of the barn's wooden beams as they groaned under the weight of the cold. Sam had been through many storms in his life, both literal and figurative. But this one felt different. There was a restlessness in the air, a tension he couldn't shake. The outlaw he had spared was gone for now, but Sam knew that it wasn't the last he'd see of men like him. In the West, once a name was made, especially a name like his, there was no walking away from it. The reputation of Sam Calder, the ghost, might have been dormant for a time, but it had a way of catching up with you. The fire inside his cabin crackled, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Sam sat in a weathered chair, his boots propped up on the hearth as he stared into the flames. His revolver lay within arm's reach, its cold steel a constant reminder of the life he had left behind. But the weight of the past was always there, hovering over him like a storm cloud waiting to burst. It had been years since Sam had fired a shot in anger. Years since he had been forced to draw his gun in defense. But in one single afternoon, everything had changed. A band of outlaws had come to his land, and without warning, they had thrust him back into the world he had sworn to leave behind. His mind drifted back to the young outlaw he had spared. He had seen fear in the man's eyes, fear of death, fear of the life he had chosen. The boy had begged for his life, and Sam had granted it. But something about the exchange had unsettled him. Was it mercy? Or was it a reminder of his own youth, when he had been just like the outlaw, reckless, full of ambition, and willing to do anything to survive? The past was never far behind. It had a way of coming full circle, of reminding you of things you couldn't forget. As the fire continued to burn, the world outside the cabin remained still. The horses in the corral shifted restlessly, but the ranch itself was quiet, too quiet. Sam could hear nothing but the wind, the occasional thud of the hooves, and the soft crackle of the flames. He didn't know how much longer he could live like this, waiting for trouble to come. He had been a gunslinger in his past life, a man who had made a name for himself with his speed and precision, but now he was just a rancher, a man trying to live a peaceful life. Or so he had thought. The West had a way of drawing men back into the chaos, whether they wanted to or not. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke the silence, the unmistakable clip-clop of hooves approaching. Sam's hand instinctively went to his revolver, his senses sharpening. The wind shifted, and he could hear the sound of horses drawing closer, moving fast. Someone was coming, and it wasn't a lone rider this time. Sam's heart quickened, his instincts kicking in. He had been through this before. He had been the one riding into towns, guns blazing, eyes filled with purpose. But this time, he was the one being hunted. He stood up slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he crossed to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, he could just make out the silhouettes of several riders in the distance. The moonlight reflected off their rifles, their bodies hunched low in the saddle. They were coming for him. He knew that much. The gang hadn't given up, and this time, there were more of them. Sam didn't wait to see them closer. He knew better than to let them get any nearer. He had to act fast, had to be ready before they thought they had him cornered. He moved quickly to the back door, grabbing his rifle from where it rested against the wall. His revolver was still at his side, but he would need the rifle for this fight. The barn was too open, too exposed, and he didn't have time to move the cattle out of harm's way. His only hope now was to make the outlaws think twice about charging his land. With his rifle in hand, Sam moved silently toward the back of the cabin, his boots leaving no trace in the snow. He positioned himself behind a large stack of hay bales near the barn, crouching low, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could hear them now, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing through the plains as the riders drew near. Sam took a steadying breath and peered over the top of the hay bales. The riders were getting closer. He could see their faces now, hard men, determined, and filled with the arrogance that only outlaws had. They weren't worried about Sam Calder. Not yet. The group of riders approached cautiously, their horses moving in a loose formation as they scanned the area. They were expecting resistance, but they weren't prepared for Sam's silence. They hadn't counted on the old gunslinger hiding in the shadows. Sam adjusted his grip on the rifle, his eyes locked on the first rider. He didn't make the mistake of hesitating. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the cold night air. The first rider collapsed, his body jerking as the bullet struck him in the chest. The others reacted quickly, drawing their guns and firing wildly in Sam's direction. But Sam was already moving, already ducking behind another pile of hay. He fired again, hitting a second rider who had made the mistake of getting too close. The rider's body crumpled to the ground with a grunt. The remaining outlaws scrambled, trying to regroup, trying to find a way to overwhelm Sam. But Sam Calder wasn't going to let them win. He had made his choice, and he would protect what was his until his last breath. The wind had picked up again, howling across the plains, the cold bite of winter sharp in the air. The remaining outlaws had been caught off guard by Sam Calder's swift attack. 2 of their number lay in the dirt, their bodies already growing cold in the night. The others, however, had regrouped quickly, their survival instincts kicking in as they ducked behind rocks and scattered hay bales, trying to find cover from the deadly fire coming from Sam's direction. Sam's pulse was steady, his movements fluid and precise as he reloaded his rifle. He knew they would try to come around from the sides, trying to flank him. He had been in enough gunfights to recognize the patterns, the way men like these operated. They would make a move to outsmart him, to use their numbers to their advantage, but Sam wasn't about to let that happen. He moved with purpose, positioning himself higher on the hill, giving him a better vantage point. The outlaws hadn't realized yet that Sam was always 3 steps ahead. They thought they could catch him by surprise, but they were the ones who had made the mistake. From his new position, Sam could see the entire landscape, the group of riders scattered across the snow-covered plain like pieces on a chessboard. He didn't need to hesitate. He didn't need to plan any further. The moment had come. He fired again, the rifle's crack echoing across the wide, empty plains. A rider fell, his body limp as the bullet hit its mark. Sam moved quickly, taking down another before the man had time to react, his body crumpling to the ground, his gun still raised, but no longer a threat. The remaining outlaws began to panic. They had underestimated Sam Calder, and now the fear in their eyes was palpable. They were down to 3, and they knew they were running out of options. They tried to make a run for it, but Sam had them cornered. The night was his. It had always been his. One last shot rang out, and the final outlaw collapsed, his body falling backward, his rifle hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Sam's breathing was steady as he surveyed the field, his eyes scanning the bodies of the outlaws he had just taken down. They weren't moving anymore. They were gone. Sam lowered his rifle, his eyes cold and distant. The fight had been quick, but it wasn't over yet. The ranch had been his once again, but the victory felt hollow. He had killed men today, men who had come for his land, but it was the same old story. the same story that had played out so many times before. He stood in the stillness, listening to the wind as it whipped through the plains. His fingers tightened on the rifle's stock, but he didn't fire again. There were no more targets, no more threats. The land was safe, for now. He didn't feel any satisfaction from the fight. The adrenaline had faded, and now there was only the cold, harsh reality of what had happened. He had killed men, and while Sam Calder had made a life for himself, a life he thought he could keep, it was never truly safe. Not with the name he carried, not with the legacy of the ghost hanging over him. Behind him, the faint sound of hooves reached his ears. It was the young outlaw, the one he had spared earlier. The boy had returned, his horse moving cautiously as he approached the ranch. Sam could see him now, the silhouette of the rider framed against the darkening sky. The outlaw had kept his word. He was alone. Sam didn't move, his rifle resting loosely in his hands as he watched the boy approach. He had promised not to come back, and now he was here again. Sam wasn't sure what to make of it. The boy had left, had run, but he had returned. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. But whatever the reason, Sam wasn't about to make the same mistake again. The outlaw dismounted slowly, his face pale from the wounds Sam had given him earlier. He wasn't looking for a fight. The fear was still evident in his eyes, and his hands were raised in a silent gesture of peace. "I kept my word," the outlaw said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I wasn't gonna come back, but I couldn't just leave. Not after what you did." Sam studied him, his expression unreadable. The boy didn't have the hardened look of an outlaw. He wasn't built for this kind of life. He was just a man caught up in something he didn't understand. Sam had been that man once. Young, foolish, and too quick to pull the trigger. "Why'd you come back?" Sam asked, his voice low. The outlaw hesitated, glancing around at the bodies of his fallen comrades. I couldn't leave them. I couldn't just run and pretend I wasn't part of what happened." Sam nodded slowly, his eyes hardening. He didn't know why the boy had come back. Maybe he was looking for redemption. Maybe he was looking for something to make sense of the violence, the fear, and the bloodshed that had defined his life. "I'm not asking for your help," Sam said, his voice steady. "But if you're here to bury your friends, then you better get to it." The outlaw nodded silently and moved toward the bodies of his fallen comrades, his movements slow and hesitant. Sam didn't watch him. He didn't need to. This wasn't his fight anymore. He had made his choice. For the first time that evening, the silence felt different, calmer. Sam Calder stood on the ridge, looking out at the horizon. The outlaws were gone, but the West wasn't finished with him. The winds of change had started blowing, and Sam knew it was only a matter of time before someone else came looking to take what was his. But this time, Sam Calder was ready. The wind continued to howl, swirling the dust and snow in harsh gusts that bit at Sam's skin. He stood motionless on the hill overlooking the scene, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the remnants of the outlaws' horses wandering aimlessly across the plain. The setting sun painted the sky with shades of purple and orange, but it was all too brief. The peace Sam had fought so hard to create was fleeting, and he knew it. There was always another group, another challenge on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. The young outlaw had finished burying his comrades, his movements slow and deliberate. There were no words exchanged between Sam and the boy, just the heavy silence that hung between them. Sam had said his piece, and now the boy had done what Sam had asked. He had taken care of his own. As Sam watched the last shovelful of dirt cover the bodies, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake sparing the boy. The young outlaw's eyes had looked almost lost, like he was searching for a path out of the darkness. But Sam knew better than to believe in redemption. The West was unforgiving, a place where only the strong survived, and it had claimed too many lives to leave room for second chances. He had lived through enough to understand that the only thing certain in this land was death. And if the boy was to survive, he would need more than just a fresh start. He would need to harden his heart. Sam turned his back to the boy and walked toward the cabin. His boots crunched in the snow with each step, the sound filling the air like the heavy weight of his thoughts. The cabin door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping inside where the warmth of the fire provided a temporary reprieve from the cold that gnawed at his bones. But it was fleeting. Even in the warmth, Sam could feel the tension building inside him. He couldn't relax, not while there were still men out there, waiting. Behind him, the door opened, and he heard the sound of soft footsteps, followed by the quiet voice of the outlaw. "I'm leaving, like I said." Sam didn't turn around. He didn't need to see the boy's face to know what he was going through. He had been there before. The boy wasn't a killer, not yet, but the West had a way of turning people into something else. A man either adapted or perished. Sam had survived by becoming something he never wanted to be, and now it was too late for regrets. "You're not coming back?" Sam asked, his voice steady. The outlaw hesitated. Sam could feel the weight of the moment, could feel the boy struggling with something inside. Whether it was fear, guilt, or a simple desire to survive, Sam didn't know. But he knew the boy wouldn't be able to outrun this life forever. It would find him eventually. "I won't," the boy replied, though there was doubt in his voice. "I can't. Not after everything." Sam nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He didn't need to offer advice, didn't need to tell the boy that the road ahead would be tough, or that he would likely find himself in situations that he couldn't avoid. The boy would figure it out, one way or another. They all did. "Good luck," Sam said, the words as empty as they sounded. They meant nothing. Sam didn't believe in luck, and neither would the boy after he'd seen enough of the world. The outlaw lingered at the door for a moment longer, his hand resting on the handle as if considering one last thought. But then, without another word, he stepped out into the cold night, disappearing into the darkness as Sam remained inside. He didn't look back. For a long time, Sam just stood there, staring into the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. The weight of his past, the gunfights, the violence, the men he had killed, it all seemed so distant now, but the memory still clung to him like a second skin. He had done what was necessary to survive, but sometimes he wondered if he had lost more than just his old life. Sometimes he wondered if he had lost the very part of him that could have made the land worth fighting for. But there was no time to dwell on those thoughts. There never was. The night was still young, and there was always someone new on the horizon. Sam could hear the faint sound of hooves again, but this time, it was different. This time, the rider wasn't alone. He stood up quickly, moving toward the door, his hand already reaching for his revolver as he stepped outside. His eyes scanned the darkness, and he could make out the silhouettes of several riders approaching from the east. They weren't here to chat, and they weren't here to negotiate. The riders were already too close. Sam's heart rate picked up, his senses sharpening. The weight of the past few days pressed heavily on him, but there was no time to think. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the night, his boots crunching in the snow as the wind howled once more. He had fought to protect this land before, and he would do it again. He had no illusions about who these riders were. They were part of the same outlaw gang that had come to his ranch before, and they had come for more than just cattle. They had come for blood. Sam Calder didn't wait for them to speak. He raised his revolver, his eyes locking onto the first rider in the group. His hands moved with practiced precision as the gun roared to life. The first shot hit its mark, sending the rider tumbling from his horse, but Sam didn't stop. He moved quickly, firing again, and the second rider was down before he could even react. The remaining riders scattered, their faces twisted in fear and anger as they realized who they had crossed. They hadn't come for a quiet rancher. They had come for a legend, for the man they had heard about in every saloon, every town, whispered in hushed voices, Sam Calder, the ghost of the West. And now, they would learn what it meant to challenge him. The riders had no idea what they had just walked into. Sam Calder's revolver thundered in the night as he took down two of them before they even had time to draw their weapons. The others hesitated for just a moment, uncertainty creeping into their ranks as they realized their plan was falling apart. They hadn't expected this, not from a rancher they'd pegged as an easy target. But Sam wasn't just a rancher. He was the ghost of the West, the name that haunted the minds of those who'd crossed him in the past. The remaining outlaws scrambled, their horses kicking up dust as they tried to reposition, trying to flank him from either side. But Sam had been through this many times before. He wasn't about to give them the advantage. His rifle still in hand, he moved quickly, darting from cover to cover, always one step ahead, always keeping his eyes on every movement around him. The moon had risen higher in the sky now, casting an eerie, silvery glow over the plain. The wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of dust and the cold, but Sam's focus remained razor-sharp. There was no fear in him, only the cold certainty that this was a fight he could win. It wasn't arrogance, it was experience. He had faced down bigger odds before and walked away. Tonight would be no different. A bullet whizzed past him, close enough that he could feel the wind it cut through. Sam didn't flinch. He was already moving, his rifle coming up in one fluid motion. Another shot rang out, and the rider who had taken the shot crumpled from his horse, the bullet finding its mark in his chest. But there were still more of them, 3, maybe 4. Riders who weren't about to give up just yet. Sam didn't pause to count. He fired again, hitting another outlaw in the shoulder, knocking him off his horse. The man hit the ground hard, but he didn't get back up. The remaining riders were closing in now, realizing that their numbers had been reduced and that they were in danger of being picked off one by one. They tried to regroup, huddling together behind their horses, their guns raised. But Sam wasn't about to give them that luxury. He moved swiftly, always staying low, always staying unpredictable. The last 2 outlaws tried to make a break for it, riding toward the barn where they hoped to take cover. Sam saw them coming and knew they would try to escape, but he wasn't about to let them get away. His revolver was already drawn as he raced forward, closing the gap between him and the 2 men in a blur of motion. The first rider barely had time to react before Sam's gun was in his face. The shot was quick, merciless, and the man collapsed, his body hitting the dirt with a sickening thud. The second rider drew his pistol, but Sam was already on him. He shot the man's gun from his hand with a precise shot, knocking it away. The rider froze, his eyes wide with fear. Sam's revolver clicked empty. The fight was over. The last rider stood there, his hands raised in surrender, his body trembling. Sam didn't lower his gun right away. He waited, his eyes locked on the outlaw's face, watching for any sign of trickery. "You don't have to kill me," the man said, his voice hoarse, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. "We were just after your cattle. We didn't know it was you." Sam studied the outlaw for a moment, his gaze unreadable. He had heard this before, excuses, justifications. It didn't matter. These men had come to take what was his. They had crossed a line. "You made your choice the moment you set foot on my land," Sam said coldly, his voice flat. "You don't get to turn back now." The outlaw's eyes widened in fear, but Sam didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot rang out, the last sound of the night, the final act in a violent, brutal dance. The rider fell to the ground with a thud, his body limp in the dirt. The battle was over. The outlaws who had come to take Sam's ranch were now gone, their blood staining the earth beneath them. Sam stood still for a moment, his breath steady but his heart still pounding in his chest. The cold air stung his skin, but the rush of battle, the intensity of the fight, still thrummed in his veins. He holstered his revolver and stood tall, looking out over the land that was his by birthright, his by choice. The outlaws had come for it, had come for him, but they wouldn't be the last. There would always be men like them, greedy, desperate, looking to take what didn't belong to them. Sam Calder knew that better than anyone, but he wasn't afraid. Sam moved back toward the cabin, his steps slow but sure. He didn't look at the bodies of the fallen outlaws. They weren't worth his attention. He had taken care of them, and now he had work to do. When he entered the cabin, the fire still burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Sam didn't sit by it, though. He wasn't a man who needed warmth or comfort. His mind was already on the next step, on what came after the fight. The outlaws were gone, but there was no peace. Not here, not in the West. The boy, the outlaw he had spared earlier, was nowhere to be seen. Sam didn't know if the kid had truly left, if he would ever come back. But that was something Sam didn't concern himself with. The boy had made his choice, and Sam had made his. As Sam sat at the table, cleaning his revolver methodically, his thoughts were far from the dead men outside or the boy who had run off into the night. He knew that the quiet moments were rare, fleeting, but there was a feeling settling over him now, something more palpable than the ache in his limbs, something that gnawed at him from the inside. It wasn't peace. It was the certainty that the past was never really behind him. Sam Calder leaned back in his chair, his revolver clean and polished, resting on the table before him. The fire had burned down to a low ember, casting faint shadows against the walls of the small cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows as it swept through the barren Montana plains. The cold was pressing in from every direction, but Sam wasn't thinking about the weather. He wasn't thinking about the work that lay ahead on the ranch, or the cattle that needed tending. His mind was somewhere far away, somewhere back in his past. The quiet had settled into his bones, but it was a different kind of quiet now. This wasn't the peace he had come to Montana seeking. No, this quiet was the kind that came after violence, the kind that followed a life lived too long on the edge of survival. He had killed men. He had watched them die, one by one, and for what? Land? A ranch? A home that could just as easily be taken away? There was always something to fight for in the West, but the cost of fighting never seemed to lessen, and it never would. Sam was a man who knew that better than most. The outlaws had come, thinking he was just a rancher. They hadn't known who they were dealing with. He had taken them down, 6 men in total, but now there was nothing left but the aftermath. The boy, the outlaw he had spared, had disappeared into the night. Sam didn't know where he had gone, or if he would ever return. Part of him didn't care. The boy was just another part of a system that churned out men like him. Men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs, men who had no other choice but to ride or die. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting a dull orange glow across the cabin. Sam's hand rested on the table, his fingers grazing the smooth surface of his revolver as he stared into the embers. His eyes were distant, lost in thought. He had made it this far, but for what? The world around him was changing, and Sam could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The door to the cabin creaked open, breaking the silence. Sam didn't need to turn to know who it was. He could feel the presence before the sound of the door even reached his ears. The young outlaw stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, his face illuminated by the faint light from the fire. He was back. "I thought I told you to leave," Sam said, his voice low and rough, as if the words themselves carried the weight of the burden he'd been carrying for too long. The boy hesitated, standing there for a long moment as if trying to gather his thoughts, his eyes flicking nervously over the room. "I couldn't," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I couldn't leave it like this. I couldn't walk away after what you did. What you showed me." Sam's gaze hardened, and he stood slowly, the weight of his revolver at his side as he crossed the room. His boots scraped against the floor as he moved, the air between them thick with unspoken words. He didn't need to hear the boy's excuses. He didn't need to understand why he had come back. The truth was simple. The kid had been given a chance, and now it was Sam's decision what to do with him. "You think this life is some kind of lesson, don't you?" Sam said, his voice carrying the edge of experience, of pain that the boy couldn't possibly understand yet. "You think you can just walk away from this, and everything will be fine? It doesn't work that way." The outlaw shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his hand twitching at his side. "I never asked for any of this. I never wanted any of it." Sam sighed, his shoulders sagging as he turned away, his gaze drifting back to the embers in the fire. "None of us do. But here we are." The boy stepped closer, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I don't want to go back to that life. I'm not like them. I'm not like the others." Sam's hand tightened around the handle of his revolver, but he didn't draw it. He wasn't about to shoot the boy. No, he wasn't like the men who had come for his land. He wasn't a killer by nature. But Sam had learned that the world didn't care about good intentions. It only cared about survival. Sam turned back toward the young outlaw, his face unreadable. "If you think running from this life is easy, you're wrong. It never is." The boy's face softened for a moment, but the fear remained, lurking behind his eyes. "I just want a chance to live, without looking over my shoulder all the time. I thought maybe you could show me how." Sam studied him for a long moment. He could see it, the hunger in the boy's eyes, the desperation to escape. It wasn't the same as his own desperation years ago, but it was close enough. Sam had been that young man once, looking for a way out, thinking that there was more to life than the gun, the violence. But in the end, the violence had followed him. It always did. The old gunslinger's face softened slightly, his hand falling from his revolver. He didn't have the answers the boy was looking for, but he had lived long enough to know that survival wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about escaping the past. It was about making choices and living with them. "I can't teach you how to leave this life behind," Sam said, his voice steady but firm. "But I can teach you how to survive it." The boy's face lit up with something like hope, but Sam wasn't fooled. There was no escaping the past. Not in this world. The land they stood on was unforgiving. The men who came for it, for his land, would return. And when they did, Sam would be ready. "Get some rest," Sam said, his tone softening just a bit. "You've made your choice. But there's no turning back now." The boy nodded, his eyes meeting Sam's, filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. He had crossed the threshold, just as Sam had. There was no going back for either of them. As the boy settled into the corner of the room, Sam stepped outside, his gaze sweeping across the plains once more. The wind had died down, leaving the land eerily quiet. The outlaws were gone, but Sam knew it wasn't over. There would always be more men like them, coming for what they thought they could take. And Sam Calder would be ready. He had to be. Sam Calder stood outside, the cold bite of the evening air stinging his face as he gazed out across his ranch. The land stretched out before him, bathed in the ghostly light of the moon. The wind had died down, leaving only the soft, steady rustling of the trees in the distance. It was eerily quiet. Even the horses in the corral had settled down for the night, their restless movements stilled. The world felt still, as if it were holding its breath. Sam had fought to protect this land for years, and tonight, he had fought again. The outlaws had come, and he had sent them to their graves. But something about this moment felt different. There was a weight in the air, a tension that he couldn't shake. The young outlaw had returned to his cabin, but Sam knew he wasn't out of danger. No one who had crossed the wrong men ever truly found peace. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the worn leather holster. His mind wandered back to his younger days, the days when he had been a fast gun, feared and respected across the frontier. But the years had softened him, or so he thought. The quiet life he had made for himself here in Montana had been his refuge, a place to escape from the violence he had lived. But the West didn't allow for such peace. The past always came knocking. Sam took a slow breath, steadying himself against the growing sense of unease. He could feel the weight of his past closing in on him once more. It was like the calm before a storm, the moment when everything seemed perfect, but you knew something bad was about to happen. He turned back to the cabin and walked inside, the door creaking softly as it opened. The fire still burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room, but it did little to soothe the restlessness in Sam's chest. The boy. He couldn't bring himself to think of him as anything but the boy still sat in the corner, his eyes vacant, lost in thought. Sam didn't sit down. Instead, he crossed the room, his boots heavy on the floor, and stood near the table. "You get some rest?" he asked, his voice low. The boy nodded, but there was no conviction in his answer. "I guess so." He didn't meet Sam's gaze. Sam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "What happens now?" The boy looked up, his eyes uncertain. "I don't know. I thought I could leave it all behind. I thought if I just ran far enough, I could start fresh. But it doesn't work like that, does it?" Sam's gaze softened, just a little. He could see the boy's confusion, the uncertainty in his eyes. He had been there himself, once. Young, full of hope, desperate for a way out. The difference was that Sam had never had anyone to guide him. No one had ever told him that running from the past didn't work, that it always caught up with you, sooner or later. "No," Sam said quietly, "it doesn't work like that. You can run, but you can't outrun your choices. You can only live with them." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be part of their gang. They came to me, said I could make money, said I could make a name for myself. I didn't know what I was getting into." Sam nodded slowly. He had heard this story before, countless times. It wasn't new. It wasn't even unique. There were always men like this, young, naive, willing to follow the wrong path because they didn't know where else to turn. But there was no pity for them in the West. There was only survival. "You're here now," Sam said, his voice even. "You've made your choice, and now you need to figure out what to do with it. You want to survive? You learn fast, and you make sure you never forget who you are. You can't change what's been done, but you can control what happens next." The boy looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching nervously. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be like you." Sam sighed softly, pushing himself off the wall and walking over to the window. He gazed out at the land he had fought for, the land he had killed for. It was his, but sometimes it didn't feel like enough. "Being like me isn't what you want," Sam said quietly. "I'm not someone you should want to be. This life doesn't leave room for anything else. No family, no friends, just land, cattle, guns, and eventually, death. I don't want to make a killer out of you. You have to find your own way." The boy's eyes searched Sam's face, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. Sam could see it in the boy's eyes. He wanted hope, a way out. But hope wasn't something Sam could give him. Not here. Not now. "There's no way out of this life unless you make one for yourself," Sam said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "And even then, you have to be ready to face the consequences. There's no escaping what you've done, but there's always a choice in how you move forward." The boy nodded slowly, though his face was still clouded with uncertainty. Sam could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't ready, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the boy could find his own way out of this life. Maybe he could make something of himself. But Sam knew better than to count on that. The West was full of men who thought they could outrun their past. And for most of them, that past caught up with them in the end. "I'll teach you how to survive," Sam said, his voice steady, "but it's up to you to decide whether you live or die." The boy looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time. Sam could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty. But there was something else there, too. Something that resembled determination. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sam turned away from the window, his hand resting on the revolver at his side. The night outside was still and silent, but Sam knew that the quiet wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and he had to be ready. The night was long, and Sam Calder knew that the quiet moments were fleeting. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the old ghosts that haunted him in the stillness of the evening. The land outside his cabin was vast, endless in its emptiness, and Sam had come to understand it well. The horizon, the wind, the mountains, all of it was a part of him, but it was also a reminder that nothing ever stayed the same in the West. The boy, still young, still full of uncertainty, sat by the fire in the cabin, his hands folded in his lap as he stared into the flames. Sam could see the struggle in his face, the way he fought with his past, trying to reconcile it with the new life he'd found. Sam had never been one to offer words of encouragement or hope. He wasn't that kind of man. His life had been built on cold, hard truths, on survival. But tonight, he felt something stirring inside him. A kind of recognition, a desire to make sure that the boy didn't fall into the same trap he had once walked. "You still think you can outrun your past?" Sam asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. The boy looked up, his expression troubled. "I'm trying to forget. I'm trying to move forward." Sam's lips curled slightly, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You can try, but the past has a way of catching up with you. You can't just forget the things you've done. The only way to deal with it is to face it head on." The boy shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward the door as if he wanted to escape. But Sam wasn't done. He needed to make sure the kid understood that running wasn't an option. Not here. Not in the West. Sam took a slow breath and walked over to the table, where his revolver lay. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hand, the cold steel comforting in a way that nothing else could. The boy watched him, his eyes still full of doubt, of fear. "Look at this gun," Sam said, holding it up. "This is what I used to make my name. I've killed more men than I care to count, and each one of them left a mark on me. Not a physical one. No, those heal. But the ones on the inside? Those don't go away. The guilt, the memories, they stay with you, whether you want them to or not. The boy's eyes dropped to the revolver in Sam's hand. It was as if the weight of Sam's words finally reached him. He had seen enough death, enough violence, to know what Sam meant. "I know what you've been through," Sam continued. "I know you've seen things, done things, that you can't undo. But the only way to live through it is to keep moving forward, to keep surviving. Because if you don't, you'll just get swallowed up by it. And believe me, that's the last thing you want." The boy looked up at Sam, the fear still in his eyes. But now there was something else there. Something that wasn't fear, but recognition. He had heard what Sam was saying, and he understood. For the first time, Sam could see the boy thinking about the future, not just running from the past. "I don't know if I can be like you," the boy said quietly, his voice filled with doubt. "I don't think I could ever kill like that. I don't want to be like them." Sam studied him for a moment, then set the revolver back down on the table. He wasn't trying to make the boy into a killer. That wasn't the point. The point was that survival in the West meant making hard choices, choices that left scars on your soul. Whether he liked it or not, the boy would have to face those choices. The world didn't care about good intentions. It only cared about what you did to stay alive. "You don't have to be like me," Sam said, his voice quieter now, almost gentler. "But you have to be strong enough to face the choices you've made. You can't let them define you, but you can't run from them either. You have to learn to live with them." The boy sat in silence for a moment, his gaze still focused on the revolver. Sam could see the weight of it in his eyes, the way it symbolized everything the boy had been through. Sam wasn't trying to make him into a man like himself. He wasn't trying to force the boy into a mold he didn't fit. But Sam knew that in the end, the boy would have to find his own way, his own path. Sam walked to the door of the cabin, his boots heavy against the floorboards. The night was still, but there was something stirring in the air. He could feel it. The land wasn't done with him yet, and he knew that the boy would face his own battles. He couldn't protect him forever, but he could make sure the kid knew how to survive when the time came. As Sam stepped out into the cold night, he glanced back at the cabin, his eyes locking with the boy's for just a moment. There was a flicker of understanding there. Maybe it was just a glimmer, but it was enough. The storm was coming. Sam could feel it in his bones. But tonight, for just a few hours, the land was quiet, and Sam Calder allowed himself to rest. For now, if you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.